Hello, and you're very welcome to Farmland. Coming up a little bit later on the programme, we'll be joined by agricultural economist Ciaran Fitzgerald, who'll be discussing the rising costs facing farmers and the ongoing fallout from Budget 2023. But first on the show today, I'm joined by Director of Policy and Chief Economist with the Irish Farmers Association, Tadhg Buckley. Tadhg, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for the invite, Aisling.
Now, the CAP strategic plan has been given the green light by government, of course, the EU Commission giving it its approval back in August. Another step forward for CAP, but some farmers out there may be a little bit hesitant about what's coming in 2023. Some may feel that they're going to be asked to do a good bit more for somewhat less.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary, Aisling. I suppose really what we're seeing today is just formality, really, because I suppose the details have been fairly, have been apparent for months now. And the issue really, I think, really what you're seeing is in the Pillar 1 part of the payments, what you have now is you have a significant additional ask on farmers, which wouldn't have been there, which isn't there at the moment in terms of the requirement for the basic payment scheme. You do have greening, but the requirement from a greening perspective is not. It's not massively hard to achieve for a grassland farmer particularly, but now we're going to see the introduction of eco schemes, 25% of that pool going into that, requiring to carry out 2 eco scheme measures to qualify for that payment. And then as well as that, you have the whole flattening of payments which comes with eco schemes because of the fact that you have 25% on this 1st of January, 25% of that payment taken out, separated from what is currently the basic payment and paid on a flat basis separately. So probably,
do you think that farmers have got a good enough grasp of what's being asked of them in January?
I think a lot of farmers, it's very difficult to keep up with all the changes.
Yep.
And the change in names, like we have basic payment changing to BISP, you have CRIS, you've eco schemes, you've all these different acronyms, which I think, adds to the confusion. And I mean, it would be very difficult for farmers to stay fully au fait with it. I mean, we even...
Could the IFA be doing more to simplify it?
I suppose it's something we've done. I mean, we have put out payment guides and calculators on that side of it to try and give farmers a full understanding. But really, Aisling, it's only when you get the payment next October, in October 2023, that's when it becomes real for farmers. Because even if you do have an understanding of this type of change, and you know yourself, when you get the payment and the fact that, you have a separate eco scheme payment as well now, which won't, hopefully it may not come the same day as your BIS payment. So I think there's going to be a lot of adjustment for farmers, and it's only when you get that payment that it becomes fully real for farmers in terms of what the difference is going to mean for them.
Will it see some farmers lose out?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole nature of the convergence and the way the eco scheme is being administered leads to some farmers gaining and more farmers losing. So because you have, and that's, I suppose, was the biggest issue with CAP, is that the Pillar 1 payment fund stayed static in nominal terms, fell in real terms. So when you have a fixed pot of funds and you have a convergence impact where you have reallocation of funds, redistribution of funds, some farmers are going to gain and more farmers are going to lose. And I suppose the issue as well is that a lot of the losers are in sectors who are under pressure from an income perspective anyway and depend heavily on direct payments. So the drystock sectors, where over 100% of their income makes up from direct payments, and tillage as well, where they tend to have a higher payment per hectare because of the fact that they would have traditionally been heavier users of or dependents on direct payments. So you do have that as well. So I think you're going to have farmers that are going to be, pretty significantly impacted.
The Agri-Climate Rural Environmental Scheme, ACRES, you need acres for acres, is what has been commonly said on this programme and in other outlets as well. What do you feel, are farmers convinced of this scheme? We were at the National Ploughing Championships. There's a lot of concern about this scheme, how it's going to work, and I suppose this move to more results-based schemes as well.
Yeah, I think one of the key, one of the key problems with acres was the way it was platformed day one. So if you look at the programme for government, it was called a REPS style. It was called a REPS 2, I think was actually the term specifically used in the programme for government. So then there was an expectation created that farmers are going to get a type of REP scheme. So everybody remembers REPS, and I think it was incredibly...
And quite fondly.
Exactly. Yeah. Quite positively, very positively really. It was a very successful scheme, and what was there, you knew what you were going to get over the 5 years, and you had a scheme of measures that you had to do. What we have is a completely different animal now in acres, which, as you say, is results-based. There's an awful lot of, it's quite confusing in terms of how it's structured. Now, in fairness, I think that there's a part of that is because of what the European Commission has, the requirements put on the department. But I think the first issue was how it was platformed. It was never going to be a REPS type scheme. And then we have, I suppose the other thing is that they've set an expectation that they want 50,000 farmers in it.
That's what I was about to say, and we're hearing that it's maybe 30,000 in tranche one, and then as well there's the concern from advisors. There's paperwork to be done, there's farm plans to be done, and we're only seeing that portal being opened very recently. It's a very short window for advisors.
Exactly, so you have a few issues. You've got the fact that we're now here in October. We have a situation where, if you take REPS took well over 60,000 farmers at its peak. You have saying, so first of all, the overall ambition at 50,000 farmers we feel is way too low. There's going to be farmers that are not going to be able to get a scheme if that figure isn't moved upwards. Then we've got the second challenge with not only is it the 50,000, the fact that the first tranche is only going to take in 30,000 because of the lack of infrastructure.
Would you be confident they'll hit 30,000?
It's going to be very difficult because the planners that are involved in it, be it Teagasc or the private planners, are already creaking with the potential weight of demand that will potentially be there.
And when we're talking about incomes as well, Tadhg, for farmers, you were saying about certain sectors that rely on payments as well to top up their income or to be an income. So if you've relied on something like gloss down through the years, and if you don't get in tranche one, and then you're looking at January 2024, there's a gap in your income there.
So absolutely. And if when we look back at if you look back at a suckler farmer income, and if you look at that profile, that an agri-environmental scheme can make up 20% of their income. So we cannot have a scenario where farmers, because of the fact that they can't get in because of the size of the tranche and the infrastructure that's there for it, that they're not able to get a payment next year. They will have to be looked after in some sort of balancing payment or some form of support payment, an interim payment that allows them.
Is that likely?
I think that's something we've highlighted to the Minister in the press conference last week. He said he was reflecting on it. So I think that it's something that will have to be done, because otherwise we're facing a chunk of farmers who could be taking a 20% income hit in 2023. That can't be allowed to happen.
Another measure from Budget 2023 that's got a lot of tongues wagging out there is the concrete levy, 10%. Obviously, we see an initiative out there for farmers to modernise their slurry storage facilities. But on the other hand, then we have a 10% concrete levy. Now, obviously, the finance bill will be published later this month, and suggestions there could be tweaks to that, but I don't think there'll be a tweak as much as it'll take farmers out of the equation for that concrete levy. Yeah,
so I think a lot of people were kind of taken by surprise with this measure, which I think was it's a very kind of broad brush approach to the issue. So which an issue was related to concrete blocks initially, and I suppose, as you say, so if we take the nitrates action program, the new nitrates action program, which was put in place this year, that puts an increased requirement on farmers in terms of soil water storage. A lot of farmers are as well as that with an increased period for closed period now potentially. So a lot of farmers kind of have no choice but to put in more storage. So and then as well as that, with the fertilizer price at the moment. And we want to see farmers putting in more storage too, where it's feasible, because it means that they'll make better use of their nutrients. So in terms of the fertilizer side of it, allowing them to mitigate the increased cost. So, but we have now a scenario where farmers and those farm buildings are going to be heavily impacted by the concrete levy. And something we will be looking for as part of the finance bill is to try and see, can we have an exemption or some sort of rebate mechanism for farmers. Because if you think about it, if you're putting up a farm building relative to, say, any other type of building, there's a huge amount of concrete goes into it, because most farm buildings have a concrete tank underneath them in the form of a slatted tank. So, or even if you decide to put up just a slatted tank for slurry storage, a huge proportion of that structure is concrete. And if we look at the last 2 years, the price of ready mix has gone up by 25%. Price of precast concrete has gone up by 33%. They're CSO figures. So, I mean, we think that based on those circumstances, it's not right to include agricultural construction inside in this. And I think it's not unreasonable to say that there should be some sort of exemption for farm construction, given those unique circumstances that they have with concrete usage.
Like all parts of society, energy costs are a huge concern, especially coming into this winter. We're hearing about possibilities of blackouts, and I mean, even just in recent days, the price increases have come on board from many of the main suppliers in this country of electricity. So, I mean, farmers out there obviously looked to the budget, that temporary measure that was rolled out for businesses, including farmers. Do you think that'll be enough?
Well, I think, look, I suppose in fairness, I've been critical enough of some of the aspects of the budget. That was one, that was something, in fairness, that was a positive development. So while it won't be enough because we are facing huge energy hikes, but I suppose the concern we had at one stage was that would farmers be in scope, because there was a lot of confusion before the budget about the type of schemes that were going to come in. So at least farmers are in scope now, and it will allow them to recoup 40% of the cost once they're over that 50% threshold. So, we'll always say it's probably not enough and that it won't cover all the costs, and it won't, because it covers gas and electricity. So it doesn't cover the other energy related impact. So fertilizer, for instance, is hugely impacted because a huge part of the cost of production of fertilizer is energy related. Feed is impacted as well because of the fact that it's heavily related to energy costs as well. So it's not going to address all the issues, but it is a step, I suppose, in the right direction to help farmers to recoup some of the costs relating to electricity and gas.
Another surprise on budget day from Pascal Donoghue was for the flat rate farmers. Many farmers out there not VAT registered, 5.5% to 5% from next year. It's going to be costly for farmers.
Yeah, 46 million. And it's I suppose something that is going to hit the bulk of farmers as well, because, as you say, most farmers are unregistered. So, I mean, one of the things we've just, from our perspective, we just want to understand a bit more about how this figure is calculated, and it's something we've engaged with the department on to get a better understanding of the change that's happened. We know the size of the impact is 46 million, and I suppose we're trying to get a sense of, well, where is this going to likely go, from there on. So it is, and I suppose as well as that, it's something that'll kick in on the 1st of January and it'll hit on the bulk of farmers, because the vast bulk of them are unregistered for VAT. So the rebate that they're getting, the refund they're getting, will drop by 0.5%.
Finally, and briefly, Tadhg, if you could, where do you think that Charlie McConalogue missed a trick here in this budget? It's 2.14 billion. It's a lot of money for the Department of Agriculture. Where could he have done better?
Well, I think that if you look at it, 2.14 billion, on the face of it, it's a big increase. But if you strip out the once-offs, allocations from BAR and the likes of the Ukrainian aid and COVID aid, it's pretty flat year on year, really. It's a slight increase. And I suppose the one thing that, if you looked at what are the farmers that most need help, so if we look at it, in terms of the overall aim of the budget was for, to try and target the consumers that are most impacted, and I suppose the farmers, we'd say the same. And really, I suppose the one disappointing part was the vulnerable sectors not really getting any additional support.
Your sucklers, your sheep farmers.
Yeah, I mean, if you take exactly the sheep and suckler, and if you take even, say, we have been promised the replacement of BPS, but the replacement of BPS is not going to be the same level of funding as BPS. It's going to be reduced. So I think that was probably the one. I think that if there was one specific area that I think that could have been that merited more support, it certainly would have been there.
Well, Tadhg Buckley, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Aisling.
I'm joined by agricultural economist Ciaran Fitzgerald. Ciaran, thank you for joining us on Farmland this week. I suppose we've a real focus on the show this week on economics and what's going to be in farmers' pockets. We're seeing the Common Agricultural Policy, the next round of it is going to start in January. €9.8 billion of a budget is being signed off by Cabinet. It's a lot of money, but farmers are going to be asked to do a bit more for their CAP money in the coming years ahead.
Yeah, I suppose there's been a constant policy over the last 20 years, you could argue, of trying the CAP has aspired to doing more with less resources. I mean, the overall philosophy of the Green Deal, which it was agreed about 3 years ago and maybe needs to be re-examined in that context, was this issue that less intensive production, less use of inputs and all of that. Now, since that time, we've the war in Ukraine, the huge increase in the cost of inputs like fertilizers and feeds. So on the one hand, 9.8 billion is a lot of money. I think it's well targeted and the structure in Ireland is well designed. The question really is what happens in the marketplace, and I think over the years, the CAP and EU policy has tended to be very strong intervening on regulation, cost of production, and then very weak and very much let the market look after the price. And that's the key, because if production costs are going to go up, they're going to go up because of these new regulations, they're going to go up because of the new environmental constraints, and they're going to go up because of the carbon budgets and the requirements there. The question is, in the marketplace, will the price reflect that increased cost? Now, it has to a very strong degree in 2022, but is that sustained? And I suppose the big question is not so much that prices may come back, but is there an appetite and a realisation that if the price piece weakens, well, then the CAP needs to do more, or national governments need to do more.
Is that an Achilles heel, do you feel, of the CAP, that it's not flexible enough, it can't turn on a sixpence when we have these geopolitical issues like we're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it is, the description of EU policy in lots of things is like the super tanker. You point it in a certain direction, but if you need to turn it and it needs to react, it's quite slow. And, we've seen it with energy prices. Like, to an extent that's very concerned. And so the whole philosophy, the whole structure of energy pricing has to be re-examined. The question, I think, that you're back to over the years is, food production doesn't have any selling power. And this has been well documented and well examined, and, that's the reality of it. And therefore, food prices have, over a long period of time, fallen below the level of inflation up until this year. So the question really is, in a situation where this current price profile, which is good and strong, I mean, if you look across the products this year, the pig guys had a very tough 6 months, really tough. Everything else, prices have improved. But if that isn't sustained, the question is there a compensation in the CAP and a willingness to look at this in reality? Because
and in real time, perhaps.
In real time,
yeah.
and it's a bit like the energy thing. Like, the energy problem is a problem of war, and so that's a cataclysmic event, and you can't always predict for it. But the second part of the energy issue is that the price of alternatives are tied to the price of gas. Now, you can intervene there and you can have a more realistic approach. We need an up-to-date approach with regard to food and ag in terms of what is actually happening in pricing, and if it's not reflecting these new costs, well, it just won't work,
And moving closer to home, we've just had Budget 2023 announced, 2.14 billion for the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. What was your overall reaction to some of the headlines within that budget? I mean, farmers were looking on at something, say, a surprise on Budget Day, because so often now the budget is, a lot of the kites are flown in advance, and we know, but the concrete levy was a bit of a sting in the tail that maybe farmers weren't expecting.
Yeah, and like on the one hand, there are increased capital allowances for slurry management, so that's a good thing and a very necessary thing. But the sting in the tail is the concrete piece. I can understand the sort of the balancing piece behind this, that somebody has to pay for Micah. There has to be a levy put in, but you know, there needs to be a better understanding of these levies as to what, if they're just passed on to consumers, well, really is there an actual collection of money? And we've had this in the past with things like bank levies. So I think that has to be looked at. I know the ESRI over the weekend have said they don't think it's a good idea and the money should be found for something else. But it's part of this joined up thinking approach that we do need, which is, if we are going to address the environmental challenges and there are capital costs associated, well then let's support that, because there's no doubt there are increases on the cost side, et cetera, et cetera. So I suppose that's the piece that you'd be most concerned about. I think a lot of the other bits will have to play out. The energy compensation is it's quite a substantial amount of money at one level, but certainly at the company level, and I'm looking at this as regards food companies, the levels of support there are very, very small. There's a cap of €2 million on the support that can go to any food company. Now, we have a lot of energy intensity in the food industry. The dairy industry spends the whole year taking water out of milk. We produce all these powders. We have a lot of, in the processed food sector, plenty of companies with really high energy bills. So there needs to be a better understanding of that. And I think, again...
Do you feel, was there a missed opportunity in the budget that they could have done more?
Oh, there's no doubt they could have done more, because the usual constraint you get when there's a problem is, well, state aid rules say we can only do this. In this instance and across other member states, the state aid rule caps were lifted and more could have been done. So it's going to have to be addressed, because if you don't address it and you've got higher energy costs, well, either production goes back or jobs are lost.
Well, we're seeing all the energy companies hiking prices, only in the last week or two.
And this will lead to inflation. And then you're looking at, a budget that attempts to look at a cost of living problem and close the gap. And then if you don't do anything about energy costs, well, the cost of living goes up further, so the gap gets bigger. So that definitely needs to be revisited.
You also mentioned, obviously, the environmental obligations on farmers and what farmers are being asked to do in terms of their climate obligations. And we have the 25% emissions ceiling target as well for the sector. There was a lot of criticism that the budget didn't go far enough for that. I know we saw under TAMS, under the Targeted Agriculture and Modernisation Scheme, that there will be money to go towards large renewable installations. Do you think, did they miss a trick there as well?
Well, again, it's a question of looking at the actual firepower, the capital cost associated in doing that realistically. And like, for instance, we know that there is a lot of potential in anaerobic digestion. We know there's a lot of mention of it. There's beginning to be a joined up policy, but it's very slow to come. I mean, most EU countries have been at this for 10 years. We have an incredible potential here.
And all the time the clock is ticking.
Yeah. So, there is always a reluctance, and maybe it's the Department of Finance, to look at anything new and developmental and say, well, we'll fund that. But there really does need to be a sort of a joined up version of what the costs associated here are, because I think we've gotten through this ideological debate about the budgets and the various budgets for the sectors in terms of the carbon budgets. There was an awful lot of ideology on the environmental lobby side, saying, being very dismissive of the economic importance of agriculture, and then being very pejorative about the environmental impact. And out of that has come an agreement now. And in fact, if you look at the various sectors in the ag sector, from beef to dairy and onwards, the frameworks are there to reduce the environmental impact and to address the carbon piece. And we really now need to just get on with that. Okay, there's a finalisation in the sort of policy documents that are going to come out of the Food Wise piece, but companies are joined up on it, and companies are dealing with the fact that their customers, whether they're retailers here or abroad or ingredients buyers, are insisting on environmental measures and carbon measurement. So we just need to get on with that and move that debate away from what was a very sort of binary debate is the way I describe it. There was only going to be winners and losers, and that's nonsense.
And we spoke about that at the National Ploughing Championships recently, about how the perception of farming amongst the public was very much damaged during that time, and at least we drew a line under it with the target, but still there is a bit of a lasting effect there, I think.
Oh, I think so, and I'd always say there's two things that would always concern me about the perception of ag, and one is the dismissiveness of the economic impact. And, we really do need to better understand what we're talking about here, because yes, we have the multinational sector, and yes, we have the increase in corporation taxes. That's a great thing. But in reality, and the Department of Trade do a survey every year, the economic impact of the multinational sector is not the 300 billion of exports. It's about a 30 billion Irish economy spend, which is significant, but it's 30 billion, not 300. The spend from the agriculture and food sector is about 18 billion. We can't run this economy in an unbalanced way. We had this notion 2004 that we didn't need anything except development and et cetera, et cetera. We really need to look at the proper balance. And when you look at that proper balance, particularly in the rural economy areas, there's a huge and unique contribution from the agriculture and food sector. And, there are two sides to this issue. An
economic and a social impact in those areas.
But there's a dismissiveness of ag on the one hand, coming from a lot of the national media. And this, it's been there for a while. And there's a tendency to say, well, look, in a modern economy, how relevant is this? So that needs to be better understood. There's about 260,000 jobs right across agri-food and farming that won't be replaced because the multinational sector doesn't come to these areas. And there's a unique contribution then from the turnover in ag where the money is spent in the country. There's a huge multiplier effect. On the other hand, I do think ag needs to better represent itself. We need to represent agriculture as an ongoing economic bulwark and as an opportunity. And there tends to be, at times when ag is in the spotlight, too much emphasis on the row in the dressing room, as I would describe it, the row between the processor and the farmer. Am I getting enough for this? And if the messaging from agriculture is, we think this is a great sector, but we're not getting enough money. And I get that. I get that argument about incomes. But if that's the only message that's coming across from the plain people of Ireland who are not very well informed about this economic contribution, then they will say, well, look, really, we're not really, we don't really care whether this sector survives or not because we only hear it as a problem. So ag and food industry needs to get its messaging right, that it is very important, very relevant and capable of growth, all of which it is. We need to get that message across, as well as saying, look, if there is to be a cap, and in that cap our costs are going to go up, then there has to be a compensating price mechanism. And if it's not there, then the cap needs to be resolved. That's an entirely reasonable thing. But it has to be done against the backdrop of we have a current contribution, we can continue doing it, we'll get our environmental impacts more improved, and we are doing all of this.
Yeah, and look, finally, I suppose, Ciaran, would you have confidence? We're seeing, obviously, we mentioned at the start, a lot is going to be asked of farmers in the coming years in terms of their environmental obligations, the costings, and, if it's something even an exit scheme or a reduction scheme. A lot of the farm organisations have raised concerns about if costings have been done and impact analysis. How would you see that?
Yeah, again, it's about looking at this properly and doing it in a way that looks properly at the economic impact and at the costings. And it won't work if it's a tokenist. So if there's to be a buyout scheme, it has to be well funded. And for instance, and on the other hand, though, I would emphasise we can't have the disconnect. We've had 20 years now of very low food prices, extremely low. And, I looked at the CSO figures for food before this year, and we effectively had food prices falling against general inflation. So the real price of food fell by 16%. We can't continue to have that. Not now in a situation where, you know, you're going to up the cost piece. So that piece has to be got ready. And then if there are to be exit schemes, they need to be properly funded. And I think on that basis we can manage things. And I really do think now's the time to move on into performance, because I think the industry at farm level and at processor level can demonstrate this capability in terms of reduction of environmental impact, management of the carbon piece, and the fact that, like, you know, what keeps us all going in Ireland in the food industry is there's huge global demand for our product. Like, without that, all the other stuff doesn't really count if you don't have ongoing demand. And it's gone up in the last number of years because people want the best grass-based product they can get.
Yeah.
And again, that's back to this national debate we had, which seemed to be all framed in, oh, well, we've analysed the output of carbon associated with dairy and beef, and we who the environmental lobby are saying you should stop that and produce fruit and veg. Like, with great respect, that's dreadful nonsense. Ireland would be producing more fruit and veg if there was an economic capability and a return in it. It isn't a, you know, we didn't go into milk and meat because of an ideological, if you like, obsession with it. So the economics of fruit and veg are what they are. You know, there are distribution systems that all the big retailers have that allow them to bring in product, and the local product just doesn't get a snuff. And that's the reality of it. So, you know, the broad debate about where we're going needs to now engage in the fact that we have the capability, we can continue to make this huge economic contribution that's unique. And we are meeting our environmental targets and can meet the new carbon piece. But, you know, there's a financing cost around it. And that's where I suppose there's always this concern that there's, on the one hand, we'd like to put your cost up. On the other hand, good luck with your pricing. Well, we need those two things to be joined up.
Ciaran Fitzgerald, thank you so much for joining us on Farmland.
You're welcome.
And that's it from this episode of Farmland. Thank you for tuning in. You can keep up to date with all the latest agricultural news on agriland.ie, or you can follow us on these links.